Using a microphone. Good evening. Thank you all for coming. My name is Tracy Burnham. I'm the Social Work Department Chair for District 200. And one of the responsibilities I have is helping to organize these parent evenings where we're happy to bring speakers on relevant topics. So tonight I have Jennifer Stenzel. Jennifer is a therapist in our community. She's been working for many years serving our community, particularly our children and adolescents. Jennifer also does a variety for our schools here at District 200. She provides in-services to staff in multiple buildings, especially our middle and high schools, on relevant mental health topics. And then she also comes in and does presentations for our students on mental health issues and concerns as well. So I'm very excited to have her here tonight to talk about anxiety and taming the teen anxiety beast. One note before Jennifer gets started is that we are live streaming the event tonight, so just so you're aware, and that the camera will be focused solely on Jennifer as she's speaking and will not include any audience members whatsoever. So, even when we do open it up to question and answer, the camera again will not be focused on the audience member that is asking the question, but strictly on the speaker. So, all right. I'm going to hand this over to Jennifer and we'll get started. Thank you again.
Good evening. As Tracy mentioned, I often am standing right here in this auditorium speaking to students as well as other auditoriums and classrooms in the district. But even though I talk to students a lot, and even though I get to do in-services with teachers, this is the first time, at least for District 200, that I'm able to interact with parents in a professional way. So I know that it is a beautiful night, and there's a lot going on in the spring, and some of you probably are parents of track kids and other athletes, and you probably could have been at a lot of places this evening. And I just really want to thank you for coming out, because it is my hope that you walk away with either a new set of knowledge or a new skill to use with your tweens, which I usually say are that 11 and 12 years of age, and your teenagers. I want this, even though we're being live streamed, makes me a little nervous, but to be as interactive as possible. I'm going to tell you what I'm not going to do to force that, but what I'm going to do with students. Usually, sometimes when I'm here talking, all the way in the back are filled with students, right? And teenagers often aren't really into discussing with a presenter that they don't know in front of their peers, 500, 600. But it's really funny when I say, for a prize, if you guys are interactive, I bet we can make this a lot more fun. And all I do is pull out like a little Tootsie Roll or something, and it's unbelievable how suddenly talkative and cooperative they are. But I'm not going to do that tonight. But I do welcome not only questions, but participation as well. It's so fun. I am recognizing a lot of friendly faces. And I'm not surprised because I have a daughter who is a senior this year. So some of you, my kids, have gone to school with your kids. And I also live near here, and my practice is in Glen Ellen. But it's also really fun when you see people that you know right here in the audience, so I appreciate that. Let's just do a quick survey before we get started with specific information to find out who you all are. So, give me a wave if you have kids that are 11 and 12, are tweeners. Anybody? Okay, good luck. And the rest, give me a wave if the rest of you have high school students. And is anyone here that has kids under that age, but you're here just, getting information preventatively? Good job, wonderful. Okay, so, and I'm guessing, this is always fun, Let's see, north side versus south side. Now this time of year we often think baseball, right? So we'll do both. Give me a wave if you're a Sox fan. Okay, fun. And give me a wave if you are a Cubs fan. Wow, majority. Okay. All right. I'm a Cub fan too. It's not for the faint of heart, but I think we're coming out of the slump based on yesterday's home opener. Raise your hand if you reside on the north side. Okay. And south side, give me a wave. Wonderful. Did anybody like sneak in here from Long Island? Okay, we're good. We're all supposed to be here. All right. Anxiety. When I had to come up with a topic of what to name tonight, beast just really resonated. Because anxiety can have the force and the strength of a beast that needs to be tamed. You may wonder why on earth would I, as a professional who could specialize in a whole bunch of things, want to work with anxiety. Because even though it is a beast, and the symptoms can be overwhelming at times, under the umbrella of mental health, anxiety is incredibly treatable. So if you yourself or your kids are struggling newly or have been struggling, please know there is hope. I've been in the field 21 years, and I would not specialize in anxiety if I didn't see people get better. So we're going to talk about anxiety, how it presents itself, what you can do as a parent to either help or maybe some things that aren't so helpful, and then when to know when to seek professional assistance, whether that's through the school, pediatrician, or other mental health professionals. So, I always do this when I'm talking to kids, and I think us as parents can come up with an even better answer. No pressure. How do we, without using a textbook, define anxiety? Let's come up with a working definition. Anxiety is, I swear I need my candy to throw out. Anxiety is
inability to handle stress.
An inability to handle stress. Very good. What else?
Feeling of being out of control.
Yes, it's a feeling of being out of control, or it's a difficulty handling stress. You can combine these definitions. Anything else? Feelings of being overwhelmed. Yes. So feelings of being overwhelmed, feelings of being out of control, having difficulty managing our stress or stressors. Anything else that we're missing?
Fear-based.
And it's also a reality of someone that's very fear-based. We did well. Didn't we do well? Because I think we hit the definition of truth right on the head as far as those emotional symptoms, fear, being overwhelmed, and then it affects our behavior. Like someone said over here, the inability to effectively manage our stressors, or stressors are just things that cause us stress. You know, I've worked within the schools practicing on a limited basis. I've worked a lot in agencies, and then I've been in private practice for the last 15 years. But the reason I tell you this, it's primarily all been done right here in the Wheaton-Glen Ellen area. So as far as setting up an effective sample, I can say we're looking at the same environment of students. And what I've noticed in the last, it'll be 21 years in May, is that clients coming in to get treatment for the symptoms of anxiety, every 5 to 10 years are getting younger and younger and younger. And on the one hand, that can be pretty daunting. You can look at it as, well, that's great because the stigma of getting help is going down. And so more and more parents are recognizing, let's not let this go on for years before we get help. So on the one hand, that can be very positive. But it also behooves us to stop and pause and say, what is causing anxiety to increase among kids at younger and younger ages? So I want us to talk about that collectively tonight. Before I do, I just want to throw out a couple of, and I'm not a big stats person, but I want to throw out just a couple that I found sobering. During the beginning of adolescence, serotonin and dopamine, chemicals in our brain, decrease. And that can lead to irritability, right? Most of us just call that teenage angst, right? Raise your hand if your son or daughter is never irritable. Right? Raise your hand if you're like, my tween or teen has become someone totally different than they were before and they're irritable a lot, right? Well, some of that is teenage angst, but there's a chemical, a physiological reason why that happens. And so we're used to our teens being irritable. And although it might be hard to deal with, we're not that concerned. But what else can happen with that decrease during that time of life of those brain chemicals? It can also lead to a mood disorder. And for some students, that can be depression, and for some students, that can be anxiety. And sometimes it can lead to both symptoms. Tonight, we're only going to focus on anxiety. So, part of that, I just thought that was interesting when I learned that. That some of that happens because of the way our body chemistry is at that time of development, physically, that it leads to those emotional outcomes. 70% of those under the age of 18 experience anxiety somatically, a certain place physiologically in their body. Anybody want to guess what body area that might be? Yes, the stomach. So think back to when your tweens or teens were younger. If they often said, oh, my stomach hurts, or their stomach might be queasy, or if they might feel like they're going to vomit, but yet they don't. Some do, but usually it's just that feeling. Unless the physician ruled out something going on in the area that really is physically based, majority of that is anxiety manifesting itself physically. So sometimes that's the first sign, whether it's a young child or your son or daughter hasn't battled anxiety before, and so they're not able to really explain what's going on. But if your young person is experiencing a lot of stomach aches, that could be the anxiety rearing its head to say, pay attention, something's going on, right? So, back to, we know what it is, we've come up with a working definition, but why on earth are our kids experiencing anxiety at younger and younger ages? This is where we have a wealth of information in here, because none of our kids are exactly alike. So let's come up with why we think in the last 20 years since I've worked with teens and tweens, why anxiety is increasing. Yes?
Focus on social media.
Yes, absolutely. Do you remember the wonderful years so long ago that if you were taking your son or your daughter, let's just say back then it would have been to the mall, they don't hang out at the mall much anymore, but it would have been to the mall, right? And if you said to them, you know what, I have time to pick up 2 of your friends. You picked up 2 of them and away you all went. Everyone else in their friend group is not going to know instantly that they were not invited. I cannot tell you how often teens will sit across from me in my office and they'll, what's going on? Oh my gosh, I'm so upset. Friend drama. Okay, tell me about the friend drama. And they'll say, so-and-so was somewhere, wherever it was, and I wasn't invited. I said, well, do you know you weren't invited? Well, yeah. How do you know they were there? Well, I saw it instantly on Snapchat. Okay, well, it could be that you weren't invited, but these are your friends, right? Right. Okay, wonder how their mom drives. They look at me like, why is that relevant? I'm like, well, I drive a Jeep. I only have 2 other seats. Could it possibly be that it was a last minute thing and maybe that's all that the mom could drive? Oh yeah, you're 16, you just got your license. Isn't it supposed to be that you're not supposed to have a whole bunch of people in the car yet? Oh yeah. So again, now that there's social media, not only the impact of that, but just the distorted thoughts of I'm left out that creates so much anxiety when that's not always the case. We know already that there are research studies finding that the more teens, or anyone really, but especially teens, because remember their brains aren't fully developed till they're 26, which is hard to believe, right? They can drive a car, they're gonna go off to college, but their brains aren't fully developed till 26. But, so research is showing already substantially that the more we use social media, the higher the correlation of mood disorder, depression, and anxiety. Absolutely. So I'm glad you said that first, because that's one of the leading factors. What else is causing our kids to have anxiety? Way in the back.
Standardized testing all the time.
Yes. Yes, right? And it's funny, because when students come up with this, they kind of laugh like, is she going to say in front of our principal that we shouldn't have these tests anymore? I'm like, I don't have that much power. But I think it's, standardized tests have been around for a long time, but I think it's the emphasis, the talking about them at younger and younger ages. I had a little one on my caseload. I say little, shorter than me, and I'm short, so young enough still to probably be like 5th or 6th grade when they're talking about the tests, you know, even in elementary school, they're standardized and how important they are. So, and yes, they are important, but the emphasis on those tests, not only the ones that they really don't always know the outcome, but the PSAT, which ironically that happened today, right? And our SAT and our ACTs, and the more and more pressure to get into a good school. And it's important to educate our students about that. Absolutely it is. But when we're talking about it at younger and younger ages, whether it's a parent or they hear it in the school environment, that creates a lot of test anxiety, and if they are already struggling with anxiety, it's that performance-based. Okay, so what else? Yes?
Works and schedules and where you see everything.
Yes, yes. There are a lot of moms in here, but props to the dads that are here as well, because you are helping, because you need to, just as much. Schedules, right, of one teenager in the home, let alone if you have more than one, it's overwhelming. And so if you have someone who's an athlete, and then they're playing club, and then they're playing school, and even if you don't have an athlete, if they're in a school musical, or they're on the speech team, that's a lot of time that they are required not only to put in through practice, but to perform well at the same time. So absolutely. Let's move along. What else is causing an increase of anxiety? College, yes. Raise your hands if back when you were in high school, your freshman year, you knew where you were going to go and what you were going to study. Now, a little more seriously, raise your hands if by beginning of junior year, you knew where you were going to go and what you were going to study. Yes, there are a few. And I always tell my students, there really are some very gifted, decisive kind of people who know their callings. They want to be a physician, and you know what? That's what they do. And that's the career they stay in. But for majority of our students, they have no idea what they want to study yet, where they're going to go to college, and dun, 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 how they're going to pay for it. I hear that one in the last 5 years more than I ever had before, because our state schools, they're still really expensive. And so that pressure of mom and dad are already, sometimes they'll say, they're spending so much on me. And I'm like, oh, you're appreciative. But yet they'll realize, like, whoa, there might not be a lot left over. Or the pressure to get a certain scholarship, right? So the whole topic of college is addressed at a younger age, which is necessary. But the pressure that can increase anxiety often goes along with it. Are we missing anything? Yes. In the orange.
I think some families the older generation never dealt with it. I know in my case, we have, my son is kind of the genetic path line that's kind of just expanded into my kids.
So true. And thank you for bringing that up. Let us not forget that there is a genetic line, right? It's not 100% guaranteed that if mom or dad or grandma or grandpa have anxiety, that the children will, but certainly we can be predisposed, right? And so if we as adults have not gotten treatment for our own anxiety. We're modeling often, sadly, ways not to handle or not to cope with the anxiety well. Not saying that you're modeling incorrectly, but there's just more, there wasn't as much permission and good treatment back when we were teens. So, very important. Thank you for reminding us of the genetic link. Okay, what rhymes with mama? Drama. Often, tweens and teens have drama with peer groups or with relationships of the opposite, or in today's age, the same gender, right? So romantic relationships as well as friendships. And although that can cause stress for any student, but if somebody is prone to have their fight or flight system activated more often, more quickly than someone who doesn't have anxiety, that can really spike anxiety levels if there's tension or conflict or misinformation happening between peers. Again, both platonically and romantically. We could go on with naming some other things, but in general, you get the idea of what's causing anxiety today. Some were common, some were similar to when we were younger, but like social media and increased college costs and talking about college much sooner is definitely different today than when we were in school. So, what do we do? Raise your hand. Again, this is not on camera. I'm the only one on camera, so I'm moving around a lot, so maybe they won't be able to follow me. But raise your hand if you tend to get enough sleep. On any given night, raise your hand if you assess that you get enough sleep. Yes, we're adults, so we're responsible, right, to try to make sure that happens. Raise your hand if you try to get enough sleep, but sleep doesn't come easily for you. Maybe you wake up a lot in the middle of the night. Maybe women have got the perimenopausal or the menopausal thing going on. There's physiological reasons why you just don't sleep as well, right? A lot of us. We know that we do not cope as well or maybe perform as well on our jobs if we are exhausted. And so I often tell parents, because when teens come to my practice, I'm assessing sleep level every single session, and I'm looking for patterns. I'm asking my teens, how many hours of sleep are you getting tonight? You would be shocked how many are not sleeping. Even if we try to make sure that they're in bed by a certain time, so many of the teens that I treat are sleep deprived. So when I talk to students, or if I'm working with parents one-on-one, they'll say, what do I do? I'll say, regardless if your teen is anxious, your teen is depressed, or both, or on the verge of being, or functioning just fine, one of the things that we can have influence over is the environment in which they can sleep. Because we know that if we don't sleep, we don't cope. So things, smaller stressors like drama among friends, all the way up to something huge that might happen in their day that legit would cause more stress. How a teenager copes with that is directly correlated with how well they're sleeping. Now, some teens really can't sleep because there's not enough hours in the day. They get home, they've got a big project, they don't start their homework until 10 o'clock, and they're up till 2 finishing it, and then they get up at the crack of dawn. Hopefully that doesn't happen often, but sometimes that is a reality. But many of our students that are struggling with any level of anxiety, that's usually one of the number one difficulties that goes hand in hand, is that sleep does not come easily. It's like their body's tired, the head hits the pillow, and then guess what happens? The mind is racing, and the mind's not turning off. So you might think, well, Jen, I can't do anything about that. Well, as a parent, ask your kids, how much sleep did you get last night? Not in a way that they're gonna get in trouble, but really, how much sleep did you get last night? How much sleep are you getting? Is that because you stayed up on purpose, you were finishing a homework assignment? Is that because you were on your phone? Was that because you just couldn't fall asleep? Or maybe you fell asleep, but then you were waking up several times in the night. So talk to them about sleep. I don't ever remember my mom, and she was a wonderful mom, but I don't ever remember her asking me about sleep. So ask them. And then if they're having trouble, not just here and there, but they're chronically having trouble sleeping, that's when we pick up the phone and we call our pediatrician or family physician. And they will either want to see them or they will suggest what to do. There's the natural route. Some physicians will prescribe a melatonin that you can get over the counter, and sometimes there needs to be, not for a long term, but a short term, something to break the sleepless cycle. And there are non-addictive sleep aids that only a physician can prescribe. And you may have different feelings probably in a room this large about meds versus not meds, but if we ignore the fact that our kids aren't sleeping, particularly if they're struggling with anxiety, it's only going to get worse and not better. Yes,
I
question?
think we can't ignore the fact that kids are going to bed with their phones.
Yes, absolutely.
Our phone away, and it dings all night long until 4 o'clock in the morning.
Yes. And even though, right, schools and physicians and counselors are really talking to students and talking to parents about, charge your phone downstairs, don't have it in your room. I mean, you've got to sleep too, as parents, right? You're not the sleep police. And so even the best students sometimes will sneak down and get their phones, and it's chiming throughout the night, or they're using their screens late, even if they're not, on social media. That can interrupt the natural melatonin cycle, and it can take up to 45 minutes after they've unplugged to become sleepy again. So that's very true. If we don't put our foot down and try to make sure that they are not using screens past a certain time at night, physiologically they're set up for failure. Absolutely. So, sleep is the number one thing that we can do to try to help our students cope with anxiety. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of a weighted blanket. Right? And do we have any occupational therapists in here? Any OTs? Okay, so the weighted blankets started with our OT friends, because for those students who had, or you start off from younger kids, sensory processing issues, there used to be the weighted vest, which now moved on to some of the weighted blankets. And again, that was just for people who had sensory issues. But the neat thing that we learned from that is that the weighted blanket, and if anybody doesn't know what I'm talking about, it's a blanket that can be in the form of their bedspread, or it can be smaller than that, all the way up to like a lap blanket, but it contains almost like a bead in it that you formulate to the weight of the teenager. And two benefits besides sensory have come from using weighted blankets. Number one, it decreases stress levels. Many kids will try to do this on their own, and they don't always know why. They'll say, I sleep with a lot of blankets on my bed. And I'll say, really? Are you cold? No. But I just feel calmer. So it calms the system, and it also has been found to be effective with sleep. So I promise you, Mosaic weighted blanket does not give me a kickback at all, although they should. But that's just one brand online that I tell parents and students about a lot if someone has trouble sleeping, and even more so if they're anxious in the evening. So Mosaic weighted blankets. They're expensive, but they are very much, they're very effective. And I didn't want to just believe it based on testimonials, so I bought one for myself. I love it, and I do not share my weighted blanket at all. So that's kind of the nighttime things we can do. Another important thing that is not real hard to implement is to get our anxious sons or daughters moving. Now some of you might say, what are you talking about when they're anxious, they fidget all the time. That's not what I mean. Some of you may say, my son or daughter is not an athlete. That's okay. But research shows when we get any of us, but particularly if someone's anxious, if we get them moving, even if it's walking, even if it's going up and down stairs, even if it is having a safe area in your home where there's a punching bag, doing something physical to the point where their heart rate is increased enough is going to produce natural endorphins, and there's going to be a release. So again, you might be like, you don't know my child. Or you may, on the flip side, say, okay, so my child is already an athlete and is already getting endorphins. Yes, during the season, but on the off season, not always. So encourage your son or daughter to move daily, to get that heartbeat increased, to sweat. That is the body's natural way to combat anxiety. Anybody have a success story with that? Or find it effective?
Not me personally, but I was talking to a friend and she said her daughter would swing after school when she was younger.
Yes.
She got too heavy for the swing and started jumping on a trampoline all the way until she went to college.
Yes.
And then when she went to college, she ended up asking for her blanket. She said she was on her back to carry her to school.
Yes. Yes. And so not only is exercise good for many other health reasons, but that example you were telling me, she was self-medicating naturally, if you will, because the body needed that outlet. Before we move on, anybody's son or daughter use a weighted blanket for anxiety or sleep? Good. Effective? Good. Okay. So now you don't just have to take my word for it, but there's some other things as well. I want to talk now, so that's a little bit about nighttime routine as far as increasing sleep, moving, physical outlets. I want to talk a little bit now about the emotional, cognitive part of how to help your teen with anxiety. Cognitive behavioral therapy addresses the cognitions and most importantly the distortions that we all have. But anxious individuals tend to have a few common ones. They tend to catastrophize, right? So it will go from, oh my goodness, I forgot to turn in my homework, to, ooh, I didn't do well on this quiz, to, oh my gosh, I'm gonna flunk the course, I'm gonna flunk the class, and then I'm gonna have to go to summer school, and then mom and dad are gonna be really mad at me, and they're gonna ground me for the whole summer, my whole summer's gonna be ruined, and then I'll never get a scholarship, and then I won't be able to go to college. And do you see how this is like really going out of hand from not turning in one assignment? So distorted thoughts, catastrophizing, using language that sometimes is not only in the head, but will be articulated as they speak, always, never, that black and white distorted thinking. That's where we as parents really need to use our ears, because in an instructive, coming alongside way, we can challenge that. You know, if they think they're gonna get in trouble, they're gonna shut down, right? This is not one of those discipline moments, but more of a, you know what, I've noticed moment. So when we see that our tween or teen is using always or never, that's just one of those where we're like, you know, I noticed you're really thinking kind of absolutely about this. What do you mean absolutely? Well, you really are thinking it's never or always. Do you really think that's true? Well, no. Well, yeah. Well, I don't know. And again, it's, well, let's pause for a minute. No, really, I'm wondering, how do you see this playing out? And then we can point out gently, you know, I've noticed that sometimes, so we're going to avoid the always and the never, sometimes you tend to go to the worst case and sometimes even beyond. Have you ever noticed that? And if we get them talking at the right moment and we approach them the right way, we're lucky enough when they say, you know what, you're right. Or, yeah, I do that because it always works out in the wrong direction, the worst for me. And then again, you see that distorted thought. I will admit that someone other than a mom or a dad is usually more effective pointing out things like that to your own child. But if your child came to me, for example, that's one of the things that I would help them catch, is those distorted thoughts. Because those distorted thoughts lead to fear. We already talked about in our working definition. Anxiety is fear-based. It grows and it grows on fear. So sometimes helping them, just through observation, reframe a situation so that they can think more clearly in less distorted ways. Sometimes, though, our kids need to calm down before they can even listen to that conversation. So one of the things that I teach them, that I'm going to teach you tonight, it's a grounding technique, a centering technique. It's kind of fancy, called dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, but really it's a calming, centering technique. And it helps us, when fight or flight is starting to get revved up, to start breathing normally again, and to direct our focus on something else so that we can at least be centered enough to go on to the next step. I teach kids to do this in the classroom and at home, but you can look really informed when you help them do this as well. The reason it's called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is because we have one hand with 5 fingers, and we have 5 senses. So what we do, can you pretend that you're 15? Great, and what is your name? Okay, so if Diana were my 15-year-old daughter, and I noticed she's starting to breathe faster and get worked up, and she's talking really quick, I'm going to be like, you know what, Diana, let's do this together. Okay, Diana, I just want you to only focus on this. We will deal with the friend situation in a few minutes. Look around in this room. We're going to pretend this is your house, right? Look around in the family room right now. What are 5 things that you can see? So the first sense, sight. What are 5 things you can see? But do it, obviously this isn't a family room. So what are 5 things that you can see and hear? The curtains. The stairs. Fire alarm. Yes. And the carpet. So 5 things you can see. And then and you're modeling slower breathing and slower talking as well. And I guarantee you, they're gonna start to talk in a calmer, slower manner as well. Okay, so what are 4 things now that you can physically touch? The chair. Floor. Yes. The purse. And your pen, absolutely. So now she has focused on 5 things she can see, 4 things she can physically touch. What are 3 things that you can hear? Yes. Yes. And your own voice, absolutely. So now, what are 2 things, it's going to sound weird, but what are 2 things you can smell? Because every place has a certain scent. Let's pretend you're in the school library. What's the scent you can smell? Yes? Well, yes. Okay, and I always tell when I'm teaching students this, I'm like, can you smell the fabric on your clothes? Or can you, girls or even boys with long hair, can you smell your hair? Certain places have a certain scent. Like if we were in the school library, we might smell the books, a little bit of must. If they're in their own room, they might smell their PE clothes that they need to wash. But there's always something that we can smell. And then I'll say finally, what's something that you can taste? If they don't have something in their mouth, give them something to eat. Give them a stick of gum, give them something from the fridge, or sometimes I'll just say, what'd you have for your last snack or your last meal? Describe to me what that tastes like. So what's happened during this time is we've helped our child start to center. Their breathing, because they're not thinking about the thing that's working them up, has started to regulate again. And because we're using the senses, that helps us focus. So again, 5 things that we can see, 4 things that we can touch, 3 things that we can hear, 2 things that we can smell, and something that we can taste. At that point, they've started to calm. And also at that moment, I'll be like, you know what, why don't we just take a couple of deep breaths together? And then we can start addressing, and then they can start talking in a more centered, calm manner. I have not had a student yet say that they weren't willing to try that, or that it didn't make sense to them. Our kids are smart. If we explain to them why we want them to try something, they're going to be more apt to try it. Otherwise, it's like, oh, Mom, whatever, Dad. But if we explain to them, you know what, this is going to help us in this way. This is why I want you to do deep breathing. This is why I want you to do this centering exercise with me. It's going to help turn off fight or flight. They're going to be more willing to try it, because nobody likes to feel anxious. At what point do we know that as the best thing we can do as a parent is to get outside assistance? How do we make that determination? When do we make that determination? Any ideas? The good rule of thumb, what were you going to say?
When you can't make it better yourself.
Yes, when either the student, teenager, or us as a parent assisting can't make it better. Yes?
It disrupts daily activity.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to say. And both of those answers go hand in hand. The best litmus test is asking ourselves and asking them. You're trying to get to sleep earlier, you are taking care of yourself, you're using, you're thinking in a different manner, we've broken some of the distorted thoughts, you're not on your phone 24/7, we're not catastrophizing anymore, we're not making sure that the home environment is not putting pressure on them about college in an unnecessary way. We're doing all these things, and yet their daily functioning is impaired. That's the best rule of thumb to say, all right, we need to take some additional assistance. And then often, when we realize that, that's not always the hardest thing to realize, but the hardest question then is, well, in what form? District 200, and I know this because I've worked with them, has some of the best school counselors and social workers around. I stole one of them at my private practice. And although she can't see District 200 students in a private practice and at school, let me tell you, if you're at her school, your kids are really lucky. But the staff are very, very educated. And although they cannot give students therapy every single week, if it's something school related, for example, your student is getting over the top anxious about performance on a test, or there's drama legit going on often at school, that's when you contact those school social workers or school counselors and say, can we partner together? This is what I'm seeing at home. I'm wondering if you're seeing any of this at school. Would you have time to observe? And what do you suggest we do together? If you're suspecting your student needs more, then Wheaton has a wonderful, and the Wheaton area has wonderful agencies where there are social workers and counselors and a plethora of private practices as well. What to expect, right? What to expect is that if you take your child to an agency to work with a therapist or a private practice, or if you take them directly to a pediatrician, any one of those providers are going to assess symptoms and to see if there is enough to identify what type of anxiety do they have. Is it social anxiety? Is it a phobia-based anxiety? Is it a generalized anxiety? Right? And from there, once a proper diagnosis is made, then a treatment plan can be made. But just know, I often will tell people, just go and get evaluated, see if you meet the criteria, and even if a full diagnosis isn't met, how severe are your symptoms? And then someone will be able to come alongside, and a good helping professional will be able to address the student that's anxious and come alongside the rest of the family members too, right? Because so many of us moms and dads, when our kids are anxious, especially if it's to the point where they're having panic attacks, right? We're certainly anxious because we just want them to get well. A pediatrician, family physician, counselor, or therapist may recommend, if another level of support is necessary, some pharmacology as well. And again, that's a whole other topic for another day, but I can tell you that I've treated some teens and tweens with counseling alone, and we've seen much success. I have seen some that need assistance from a medication, and often the feedback is, why didn't I do this several years ago? Because I can learn the skills, the deep breathing, the centering, and the thought distortions, and break those ways of thinking. But I just couldn't stop the amygdala on my own from overreacting and fight or flight from going off 24/7. So a good helping professional can help you as a parent determine what level of intervention is needed. Now, I want to leave some time, if you're willing, for question and answer. And I know we can't get into anything real in depth, but I do believe that there's a lot of information in this room, because if you didn't have some kind of insight, either with yourself, your own student, you would not be here. So if somebody has a specific question, I want to answer that. If somebody has something that I haven't suggested that we should bring up that you have found helpful with your own child, that would be a great thing to share too. Yes?
Can we go back a minute to what constitutes disruption of daily functioning?
Yes, great.
So if a child is functioning but vocalizes frequently anxiety, does that constitute disruption or not?
Yeah, could everybody hear? We're talking about what does that really look like, as far as if it's interrupting daily functioning. If they're verbalizing that they're feeling anxious, but yet they're able to, go to class and all their extracurricular activities, and their grades aren't slipping, and they're not having either chronic stomach aches, or they're not having panic attacks, because that certainly disrupts everything. Then at that point, they may need someone to process verbally with, or a listening ear. But I would say if they're only saying that they're anxious, but nothing else has been affected, then they are still functioning on their daily basis. Yes?
I'll piggybacking on that. If you have an anxiety attack, but say they're like every 7 or 8 months, it's not a constant thing. How do you assess that versus, just a panic attack alone, does that mean they need help? Or?
There are some people that have gotten in a true situation that, it's not out of the blue. Fight or flight was activated that would be activated in any of us. But they were revving so high that their body went into a panic attack. And maybe that will never happen again. There are some people that have had one done and that's it. But usually they do come in clusters. And the thing about a true panic attack is the fear of having another one. The fear itself is what creates more anxiety. So unless it really is just a one-time thing, I often will say that is a red flag. Not that it's not treatable, because the panic attacks are very treatable, but that's a definite indication to say, go talk to a professional, whether it's a physician or a counselor. There is something called paradoxical intervention that I use with a lot of students that have panic attacks to break that cycle of, oh my gosh, what if? I'm like, well, you know what? We put all this energy into trying to prevent it. what would it be like if we embraced it? And they look at you like, are you kidding me? That's something I don't want. Why would I embrace it? I'm like, well, let's use the examples of hiccups. Have you ever had hiccups and you're just like, you've tried everything? You've done the water, you've held your breath, someone's trying to scare you. I mean, the hiccups are not going away. Someone says, you know what, I'll give you $100 and they pull out a $100 bill if you can hiccup right now. And the person's like, of course I can, I've been hiccuping all day. And they can't hiccup. Because what has happened, they've embraced the thing that they didn't want to do, and suddenly they want, to hiccup. It's very similar like that. And I teach a lot of my teens and tweens and my adults how to use paradoxical intervention, and I've used it myself because I'm kind of a high-strung person. And it's very effective. That's not usually one that a parent can teach on their own, but so that's why I always say, if they're having more than one panic attack, have a professional work with them, because they're so scary to have. But yet there are ways to make sure, either through paradoxical intervention, counseling, or especially medication. Yes?
What are your recommendations or suggestions if you find a therapist that you like, but then when your child's going through that process that doesn't connect with that one?
Yes.
What are your recommendations for that?
So the question is, if I understood it correctly, that you found, you found a helping professional for your son or daughter. You as a parent are very comfortable, but the teen hasn't connected. Then at that point, this is really hard, but we have to put the relationship of the teen with the helping professional first. Because they're the one that has to trust that counselor or therapist, or they just have to click with them, personality-wise and style.
So then do you just keep going through the motions?
You find a different therapist, and at that point, you can call the therapist directly or their intake coordinator, depending on how their office is set up. And you'll have already asked your son or daughter, like, what are you looking for in someone that you're wanting to work with? I know, like, with some students, I do a lot of hands-on projects, art, stuff like that. Some students I'll just talk to. It just depends on what the style is. Now, with the caveat, if the student just doesn't want to be in counseling at all and they're making up all these excuses, then at that point, you find a counselor who, like, is just patient. I mean, I've had staring contests throughout, like, to be like, you know what, like, you don't have to talk to me, but this would be so much more fun if we, like, talked about something during this session, right? Fashion, whatever, sports, but we could just stare at each other if that's what you want to do. And learn to break down the resistance, and then usually that's the type of teen, though, at the end that is like, I'm so embarrassed I did that to her, I'm so sorry. Yes. Yes.
What are ways that we can work with children to teach them that they are feeling anxious and identify those anxious feelings instead of us being there saying, okay, it's time to do the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. What are ways to help them identify when they're feeling that way or when they're about to start spiraling? How can we help them identify that instead of us always being there?
Yeah, that's a really good one. I think sometimes what's so scary in the beginning when someone's experiencing anxiety is it's just so foreign. Like, why on earth is my heart beating like crazy? Or why did I suddenly go from hot to cold? Why does it feel like there's an elephant on my chest? So helping kids understand what happens physically, just educating them, and then letting them know, I always tell people, feelings are strong. Feelings are not going to break us, right? It's like feelings can be uncomfortable, and of course we don't want them to hang around long, but our strong feelings that are positive, like excitement and joy, I mean, those can't stay long enough, right? So just educating them that feelings are normal, no matter how strong they are. And to not necessarily fear the emotion itself, it's just letting them know when to recognize that this is what it is, and I have some tools in my toolbox to use when I'm experiencing something unpleasant. Yes?
Some ways to help our teens be able to fall asleep. Say they get to bed at this time, but they just can't calm their mind. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, that's a good one, and that falls in line, like, so it sounds like even if they're following good sleep hygiene, they're not on their phones, they're going to bed at a consistent time, and they just are tossing and turning and can't fall asleep. I'm not a sleep study, like, expert or anything, but if it's because their mind is railing, or, reeling back and forth and won't stop, then I suggest For my younger kids, I do it in a creative, kind of fun way with like a feelings bag. But with older students, you can say, keep a piece of paper and a pen next to your bed on your nightstand. Write down those things that are continually go through your mind. You don't have to write a whole journal entry. I mean, some people do, but you can just make a list of, this is what I want to pick up tomorrow. And so every time their thoughts go back to that, you can say, you know what, I already wrote that down. Or for younger kids, I already put that in my bag. I can unlock the bag or open the bag tomorrow. Another good visualization can be if you help your teen find a mailbox at the beginning of your street, right? Don't make it your own, but as they get closer to home. And then they envision opening that mailbox as the bus or their own car or their parent drives them onto that street for the last time of the day. You envision opening that mailbox and all your concerns and things that you need to do tomorrow are in that mailbox. Then you have them envision shutting that mailbox. And so as they're laying there, every time they start to ruminate, it's like, wait a minute, I don't need to open that right now. So a lot of times some of those guided images can be used. For some students, they work really well, some others don't. There's something called progressive muscle relaxation where you tense and release all the different muscle groups in a progressive way. Some students that works for. If you've tried everything in the books about sleep, that's when I'm like, call your physician, because then they could be able to recommend whether it should be something over the counter like melatonin.
How much would you recommend for a 14-year-old? She's tried it before, I said this.
I'm not allowed to give that kind of medical advice because that's outside my lane, but I can tell you I've been in sessions with some of the psychiatrists that I really respect. And they were like, oh, that little medication, like a dosage suggestion, really wasn't right for that child's age and weight, rather. So that's why you would ask your doctor or the pharmacist. Yeah.
I feel like anxiety for my daughter was very different from my son.
Yes.
And what is like characteristic of boys?
That's a really good question. Sometimes symptoms of anxiety can look identical with the genders, but other times it can't. A lot of my female teens that I work with, and again, this just has to do with the stereotypes in our world. Girls often will cry when they're anxious. Boys don't often feel that they have the permission to do that. Boys sometimes will be more fidgety when they're anxious, and they'll respond better to movement and exercise, whereas a girl responds better to some of the calming, centering techniques. Not always, this is just in general. It's interesting with teenagers, if they're depressed, often it comes out as anger over sadness. I don't know if there's any stats that would say that anger always goes along with boys and anxiety as well, but it wouldn't surprise me. Because boys often are comfortable expressing all their emotions as anger. So if your son, if you're not sure if it's anxiety or not, and it's anger, find out if it truly is anger, or is that just the tip of the iceberg, and if underneath there's fear and anxiety. Yes, final two questions, because we're getting really close, and I want to be cognizant of your time. Yes?
So say the boy, try to starts to catastrophize.
It's hard to say catastrophize.
Yes, but it comes out physical. Like, he comes home and he's moping around, and then all of a sudden he comes like a jelly bean, and he's falling on the floor. And then he takes a paper out of his notebook, and suddenly everything comes out of his notebook. As a parent, do you just kind of stand back and watch this happen until they are melted on the ground, or do you try and encourage them?
And this is going to sound like a politician, I don't mean it to be. You know your child better, than anyone else, but so you kind of have to experiment. As long as it's not destructive, let them take all the stuff out of the notebook or the backpack or whatever, and let it be that way. And then sometimes I'll just comment on an observation, like, gosh, that kind of seems chaotic. What if your day has been chaotic? Sometimes they'll take the bite and they'll talk, and other times they won't. But as long as it's not leading to, like you said, if it leads to like total meltdown that is lasting a long time, then you want to do something sooner. But if he just needs to do something physical, and sometimes even subconsciously symbolic of outwardly what they feel inwardly, then I would let them. No. Yes.
Can you say something about binge eating and when to intervene?
Oh, that's a good one. I often will ask people, what do you mean by binge? Because some people will define a binge by eating like half a bag of chips, and other people will be like, no, that's like, a binge is like almost everything in the refrigerator, right? So I often find out what that binge behavior looks like. And that's one that I go to a professional with right away, just so that it doesn't turn into that unhealthy coping mechanism for something like a mood disorder, depression, or anxiety, just to get on top of it sooner rather than later. Does that make sense? Before we close, and I loved your questions, and please know I will stay after to answer questions as well. Anything that I did not offer today, because I didn't get so broad, that you found effective with your son or daughter that we haven't touched on? Yes?
I wouldn't say with my son and daughter necessarily, but adults and food and nutrition. I think like control of mood, maybe you could speak to that in teens.
Yes, I would agree. You know, sometimes the registered dietitian is the last person that we reach out to. But whether we need that like specific type of instruction, or we just really try to have a stronger pulse on what our son or daughter are eating. Because you are right. I mean, there's research that talks about not the causation necessarily, but the correlation between a healthy diet and mood and the ability to cope better versus if they have horrible nutrition filled with all these food additives, and how that can increase some of the irritability and some of the anxiety and certainly depression symptoms. Yeah, so that's a really good point. And so a lot of people, a lot of professionals know a lot of registered, not a lot, but they know we use different registered dietitians, and so that's something that a lot of counselors, therapists, school personnel can be able to refer as well. Yes?
I was just going to say, both of my children said to me, don't ever ask me how my day was when I come home from school, because I want to get that out of my head. Don't ask me that. If you want to talk to me about it, talk to me about it after we've done something else. Because then you're putting too much pressure on, do they perform at school? Do they have a good day? Do they do bad? And that's just...
I love that your kids gave you that feedback. And that's just an honest question that we just want to know, and we think it's caring, but sometimes they do need a break. And sometimes it's that knowing that balance of when to let them not talk and when to be like, okay, but we do need to touch base, but giving them the time and the space to touch base. My kids always opened up late at night or in the car. And as long as I wasn't like, okay, you're trying to skip bedtime, I made sure that I stayed up, right? Because if they were going to be more prone to open up around 9:30 or 10 or 10:30, I took every window to, and not, again, I made sure that they had proper sleep. But I really wanted to talk to them at a time when they felt comfortable to open up. So, especially with my son who wasn't, boys that aren't, not all boys are wordy, less wordy than girls, but with your child that doesn't tend to speak as much, you especially capture those moments. I have, and I'm not here at all to toot my own horn, but I do have brochures up here if anybody would like one at the end. If anyone wants to have an individual question, I'm more than happy to answer that. Most importantly, I thank you for coming tonight, but being so interactive and being vulnerable to give feedback and to share some of your own things and to ask your questions. This is why I like to do presentations, because I like to connect, and sometimes that's harder in a large group, and we all worked together tonight and did well. So I hope tonight, whether you are going to pay a little bit more attention to sleep, social media use, look into a weighted blanket, help them do a centering technique, or observe if they're having distorted thoughts. That's something that you can do effectively with your teen. Then that means that we have all done our part to help our kids manage the chaotic, stressful world that they live in and manage their day a little bit better. Thank you.